Just to give a little bit of a historical background as to this panel that we put together today, back when we first started pulling together the programming back in September, I reached out to some of our mentors and advisors, and I made the hubristic claim that I wanted the focus of today's conference to be MedTech winter is over. So back in 2021, we had the year of SPACs, and then 2022, all of a sudden, all the capital that we saw just kind of went quiet and then went silent and then went away. And we had such a built up pressure for acquisitions, for deal financing, for startup financing, that back in 2024, I believe that it was inevitable that 2025 was going to be the year of medtech financing. As time moved on, started working with our teams who were pulling it together, our panels, and I kind of chastened it back and said, turned the panel title into Is MedTech Winter Over? And then as time has gone on, we've had so many different variables thrown into the pool of attracting financing that I've scaled it back yet again to answer the same exact question of how do we go about making sure that we have enough financing to get through the next 18 months, whether we're talking about small businesses, startups, or companies that are getting ready to exit into acquisition. And so with the help of Symbiotic Capital, we've pulled together a really great group of panelists who can speak from the debt side, the equity side, and the venture financing side. So I'd like to welcome Randy Gacek to the stage to introduce the rest of the panelists.
All right, I'll introduce everybody and then I'll take a seat as well. But thank you guys for joining us after the break and hope the morning session was insightful. Our panel is called Business of MedTech, Financing Through the Fog. And so it's a little bit ominous, but there are some bright spots as well. And also not to be mistaken with the panel tomorrow that Dr. Ari Beldegren's hosting, the Business of Biotech. So want to call out the differences here. So today we're going to talk about the overall market, debt versus equity considerations, as well as some of the exit pathways for companies. I'm Randy. I'm a principal and one of the co-founders of Symbiotic. We're an LA-based credit investment firm exclusively investing in healthcare and life sciences companies. And I'm joined by four incredible panelists up here, very diverse range of perspectives. First, we have Dr. Milt. He's currently managing director, head of MedTech investment banking at Bank of America. He's been there for about 15 years, previously spent time with Bear Stearns at Barclays. Dr. Matt Cohen, so that's our second doctor, a MD at Vida Ventures, which is actually our sister fund at Symbiotic. Matt previously spent 25 years in public markets and 20 of those at JP Morgan, where he ran the global healthcare fund. Himani Bhalla, who's the senior managing director, CIO, and a fellow co-founder of Symbiotic. So we have some war stories we can share with you guys. Prior to helping launch Symbiotic, Himani spent over a decade at Hercules Capital, where she was also lending to healthcare companies. And last, we have David Lewis. He's the founder and managing partner of Gilmartin Capital. Gilmartin is a Bay Area-based healthcare growth investment firm. David previously was on the sell side at Morgan Stanley, where he covered medtech equity research, and he was the top analyst by II. So, very illustrious panel. Are these on? Yep. Mine's on. Okay, so to kick off, everyone has probably been pretty bored this year in 2025 because clearly we've entered a very volatile economic and geopolitical climate. Matt and David, I'll start with you two, and I apologize in advance for any rogue comments that these two make. I'll do my best to keep the peace, but maybe just share your perspectives from covering the public markets for so long and what you're seeing these days.
Okay. And to Randy's point, I've known these two guys for 25 years. I used to be their client, so apologies in advance. So just to give some context, so I, at JP Morgan, before I went to Vida, basically managed several multi-billion-dollar growth healthcare funds. And I invested from speculative biotech all the way to services and everything in between, including a lot of medtech, a lot of diagnostics, a lot of tools. And the way that I used to manage my portfolios through market cycles was I would essentially, have the ability to toggle between the different subsectors because all the different sectors, whether it's speculative biotech all the way to services, have different risk profiles, have different return profiles, and actually perform differently in different environments. And I would put on my biotech hat for biotech when it's the right time, when it's not the right time. Same thing in medtech, same thing in services. And I guess to Randy's question, what I would say is that after, in the 25 years that I've been, watching the public markets, been a student of it, been involved in it, I would say the last 3 or 4 years from an overall risk perspective is probably the most difficult, the worst that I've seen, especially down the cap curve and small caps. I think risk appetites are, pretty de minimis. I think the public markets buy side has been, I don't know if decimated is the right word, but it's certainly nowhere near as prominent and powerful as it used to be. And I actually think healthcare overall has just not been in vogue, especially as rate concerns came out, and especially as, most of the market coming out of the pandemic was intensely focused on, AI and frankly on 7 companies, as you'd probably call them, the Mag 7. My view is that has dissipated somewhat, but we've yet to really see yet much of a return to the risk appetites that we've seen in years past before this started.
I think from a 50,000 foot perspective, Matt's right, but he tends to be a little negative because of his childhood.
But there we go.
See, this is what I mean. This is what I was afraid of. So please continue.
But it's a very challenging, broad macro environment for healthcare. But I will, from a medical device perspective, I will give you a legitimate ray of hope. And I've studied this market for 25 years. But what is very clear in the market now is it was always hard to invest in early stage medtech innovation because there was no long-term payoff, right? Biotherapeutics was very risky, but there was always a long-term payoff with reimbursement and payment mechanisms. We never had that in devices. Now what you're actually seeing is people taking bigger bets on early stage medical devices because we've started to chip away at the payment mechanisms, new tech add-on payment, breakthrough designations. So you're starting to see multi-$100 million financings in the medical device landscape. $6.5 billion went into medtech just in the last 12 months, and that's $40+ million financings alone. What's also happening from a strategic perspective is because the payoff is there, the strategics 10 years ago that bet on size is the answer, which would be Medtronic or Zimmer Biomet. The big multinationals that bet on size and away from innovation have had horrible public equity performance. The 2 companies that have bet on innovation, Boston and Stryker, are up 7x in 10 years, right? So the strategics are starting to figure out that innovation is the only answer. There's a more robust ecosystem funding medtech innovation, and this fixing of the payment mechanism makes it so you actually can invest in sort of biotherapeutic-like trials. I have a portfolio company that's running 2 simultaneous randomized controlled trials in heart failure. In my 25-year career, I think I've never seen it. It wouldn't be possible. So there's a lot to be optimistic about in terms of medtech. I think we're at the precipice of the greatest period of sort of medtech innovation the next 5 to 10 years, but the public climate is bad. But I think from an infrastructure, ground perspective, it's some of the best I've ever seen. So I'll give you one last data point. Johnson & Johnson, one of the biggest pharmaceutical players in the world, in the last 10 years, 70% of their M&A capital was spent on biopharma. 70%. This decade, 70% of their M&A capital is spent on devices. It's a fundamental sea change in the way certain strategics are approaching innovation. Not everybody, but there's a lot of evidence that, good things are on the horizon.
And that actually always coincides with some of the issues affecting big pharma companies. They have lost exclusivity. They have a lot of problems politically in the pharma space. It's much more stable and much easier actually to do medtech acquisitions. They pretty much fly under the radar. J&J buying Shockwave, things like that.
So I think we have a good sense on the overall market and the volatility, but a little more specifically for medtech, Milt, as someone who interacts very broadly with the sector and has seen a lot of traction in the space, what are you seeing these days in terms of how rounds are coming together, how financings are getting done, and just overall outlook for medtech companies?
Yeah, I'll just give you a little bit of background. So our group, we do mergers and acquisitions and IPOs, and we've done it's been very active in medical devices over the last 10 years. So when I think about financing for, Series A or B, typically, investors look at, well, what's the exit? What's my return over a 2 or 3 years period? And so, we tend to work backwards, right? What's Stryker, what's Boston, what's Zimmer going to pay for this asset? Same thing with the IPO. What's that multiple? Where we can price the IPO at, and where can it trade up to? And then you start working backwards to a 2, 3, hopefully more than that, X return. The financing market right now, we're seeing quite a bit. There's been a lot of growth equity, so Series C and D. Companies that are on the cusp of getting FDA approval or have commercialized but really need dollars to build out their sales force and market development. So we've seen a lot of that over the last year and a half. I would say that in medtech, unlike biotech, we've seen a lot more activity. It's a lot more healthier, only because it's not a binary event, right? One point I'll make, David and Matt, again, we've known each other 25 years. We've seen the market when spine was hot, and now it's not. It's cardio, it's EP, electrophysiology, it's robotics, it's on interventional oncology. I would say the whole sector is much more clinically driven, meaning that investors are focused on data and the consolidators, the acquirers are focused on data. Before it used to be, you got 150 million in revenue growing 30%. Great. It's a great asset to acquire.
And Himani, just for our scope at Symbiotic and some of the companies that are credit worthy, what are you noticing with their overall financing rounds coming together? Are they taking longer? Are they happening as fast as you're used to seeing? Anything you can share on that?
Yeah, sure. And what we do at Symbiotic and the universe that we cover kind of spans all across what was just discussed, which is companies on the private side, starting Series C, Series D, and all the way to ones that have gone on the other side and, tapped into the capital markets and are continuing to flourish there. And I mean, how it affects Symbiotic is a different part of the thesis or different part of the story. But what we've seen is generally consistent with what we are hearing with the rest of the panel members here, which is financing is tough. It is taking longer. Bar is higher. Investors are getting pickier, buyers are getting pickier. And the way we think about the universe is that, we're somewhat agnostic. We meaning, as debt providers, we're somewhat agnostic and somewhat decoupled with the valuation battles and the valuation concerns that both from the buyer side and the seller side, the, disconnect that there is. But what we like to chase after, and that translates into probably the likelihood of success from a debt investment perspective, is the core fundamental first principle underwriting of where is the innovation? Is there clinical data? Is there enough market opportunity that's out there? And the role that we play by way of being the debt providers, I mean, we're not fighting for the best price and the best valuation, but we're, there along for the journey and helping some of these businesses kind of get to the right inflection points where some of these equity considerations, whether it's a thesis for a public offering or whether it's becoming interesting to a strategic buyer or whether it's getting ready for your next private round, it's, we play the role of kind of helping those companies get there. So going down to these basic fundamentals of what's driving some of these, ultimate outcomes that these companies is going after is what, we try to apply as our filters when we think about the right opportunities where debt can play a role and kind of help through the journey.
And for the companies that are in this room and for companies that are planning for financing, what would you say are the key questions entrepreneurs should be answering for investors? Should they be focused on early KPIs, building out their board, focusing on having relationships with UCLA, et cetera? What's top of mind? And so maybe David and Matt can share from the equity standpoint and then Himani again from the debt.
Sure. Look, there's a cliche that you've all heard, which is entrepreneurs tend to overestimate what they can achieve near term and they underestimate what they can achieve long term. And I think we've all known that cliche. It's sort of embroidered on some of our foreheads. But it's amazing to me, despite everyone being aware of that cliche, when people come to me for fundraising meetings, they seem to forget that cliche and they're telling me all the things that they're going to achieve in the next 12 months that border on the irrational, then they're going to sell the company. So I think you got to keep it a little simpler for investors, specifically in this environment, but it's good advice in any environment. So what the investor fundamentally wants to know is, I'm going to put money in your business at X valuation. I'm funding to the next inflection, right? That can be an inflection that allows you to raise more capital, or it could allow you to raise more capital at a higher valuation, but I am funding to inflection. So in a very detailed capacity, laying out for them what are the proof points to get to that next financing? Here's the money you're giving me, and these are the 1, 2, or 3 things I'm going to achieve in that window, and it's going to get us to the next financing. It's not 10 things. It's typically not 3 things. It's typically 1 thing. I think that's often missed. You have to lay out for them the value creating event, what value you're going to create with this capital and what risks you're going to reduce with this capital to get us to the next step, because it is a journey. You can't solve the entire journey with this single fundraising in this single event. So stop acting like it. So that's like number one. Number two, look,
You're
we
still
are
going.
what? I'm still going.
Get more.
I'm going to be here all week. So the I see how you put your picture in the middle. See that happen? Anyway. So I would say the second thing is unmet need. Look, you're still entrepreneurs. We're solving important medical problems. Lean heavy into the unmet need. People still we're stiff investor people, but fundamentally you're in the business because you want to help people. You want to help patients. So lean heavily on why the widget or the mechanism is fundamentally interesting because people want to be involved in big things and big TAMs. Lastly, I'd also say, you didn't have to do this in medtech 5-7 years ago, but you got to be thinking about your regulatory strategy on day one, and you've got to be thinking about your reimbursement strategy on day one. It used to be do your regulatory piece, come back and see me, and then do 5 more years of your reimbursement piece. That doesn't work anymore. They have to be an integrated approach, and they're often very interrelated. So you don't have to have all the answers like what is your primary event in the pivotal trial, primary endpoint? No, you don't. But structurally be in a position to talk about what is the regulatory strategy, why we think we can answer those. And then from a reimbursement perspective, not all the details, but what do you think is your most likely reimbursement path? And lastly, I would just say on financing, it's a tough environment. You obviously want to raise more money. One of the things that we see early entrepreneurs not being rational about is the amount of capital it's going to allow them to achieve these goals. So more is typically better in this current environment. And I'll stop there because you're poking me.
Wow.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so in the seat that I used to have, managing growth, healthcare assets, especially on the small cap growth side, where a lot of these things typically land if they go public. I guess I was a bit of a unicorn in that I could toggle between the different subsectors, but, focusing just on medtech, I think David touched upon this, but I can't, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if a medtech ever did a trial, it would be 10 patients, pilot study gets published in, a crappy, spine journal, and they'd have a product, and that was it. And so for me, my investing philosophy as someone who could go anywhere was always all about unmet need, right? About making a device that truly had an impact or technology that truly had an impact, could verify with clinical data. And the good management teams, to David's point, understood that reimbursement wasn't something you thought about later. It was part of the plan. It was as important as IP. It was as important as anything because you have to be on the front foot. The most successful medtech investments and really the best medtech CEOs, management teams that I know are the same ones that David knows and Milt knows. I'm thinking of, Shockwave. I'm thinking of Exact Sciences. I'm thinking about guys who really saw a huge unmet need and were on the front foot lining all these things up. And I would tell you, I mean, this sounds potentially it's crass, but if your technology is just, I used to walk around the NAS meeting, which is the spine meeting, and I would marvel at, oh, there's another purple screw, and how is it different than the blue one over there? And that was considered innovation. My point being that if you're not really developing something that is truly innovative and is truly differentiated, I would encourage you not to bother because life is too short, number one. And number two, as I think we're sort of laying out, the path is way too long and way too hard and takes way too much capital. So really focus on a differentiated product, technology, whatever it is, and really laying the critical ingredients about regulatory reimbursement from day one. Because if you don't have the capabilities, you don't have the product and you don't have those capabilities from the beginning, even the best products will go nowhere.
So, Milt, anything else to add from an M&A perspective? Obviously, we just shared a bunch of criteria for what companies should focus on when raising capital, but in the eyes of an acquirer, what stands out? Is it all of the same items, unmet need, or are there others that are top of mind?
Well, we were just talking about this earlier, where 20 years ago, the medtech industry was fairly nascent. But today, you look at these companies, they're pretty big. There was a decade of consolidation, large-scale consolidation. And so what that means is it takes a lot more to move the needle on top-line growth. In medtech assets, publicly traded medtech companies, the highest correlation to a premium multiple is top-line growth. And that, that's driven by execution and innovation. So my point is, as these companies approach $30 billion in revenue, it takes a lot to, acquire a $3 billion asset growing at 20%. And there aren't that many of them. So TAM is number one. So total addressable market. How big is that TAM? Second is, depends on the space. Cardiology has always been good because there's always been innovation, clinical data, pretty robust clinical data. And I feel like we're beating up spine as a sector, but it probably...
Milt was an orthopedics resident, so he has a soft spot for spine.
Yeah, the dumbest guy in med school goes to orthopedics.
That's right.
So overall, though, there's some industries within medtech, and let's face it, medtech is not a single industry.
Right.
It's a conglomeration of 15, 16, 17 different subsectors and subspecialties. Which ones have the best, the greatest degree of innovation, and usually, higher reimbursement follows that. So back to my original point, there's just a lot more focus on outcomes and clinical data, and some of these sectors just don't have it. So back to Randy's question, what are strategics? What are buyers looking for? You're looking for sustainable revenue growth where the technology is great, but maybe one of the companies you start just, doesn't have access to another $150 million in funding, but they can do it because they have 450 direct sales reps, which can take your product at 50 million revenue and get it to 500 pretty quickly. So the scalability is the second thing. And the third thing that I think over the last 5-7 years we're seeing now is a path to profitability. So it doesn't need to be profitable. They understand as a startup growth, they want to see every dollar thrown at clinical trials or new indications, top line growth, not profitability, but it has to, you can't, burn cash for another 5-7 years. So that's what's changed recently. A lot of the large caps, cash is not their problem. Just think about how bigger companies work. There's a general manager and somebody's going to get fired if, 2-3 deals don't work out. Risk is their problem. So cash, plenty of it, it's really risk. And that ties back to the unprofitability of an asset or clinical trials, right?
And just to put it in context, when you're a large acquirer, right, oftentimes when things get taken out in the small cap space or even the mid cap space, the inflection point that puts them on the seriously on the map, it's growth, like we've talked, differentiated product and growth, but a lot of it is margin accretion. So a company that's built, so it's on the cusp of getting to that point where they're self-sustainable, they don't need to raise more capital, and they can go EBITDA positive. People define it differently. That is often the trigger point, especially if they can do it at a still high growth clip and the TAM is still underpenetrated. That is where they're in the sweet spot for acquisition. And then the question becomes, what's the multiple? What's the market like? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, one unrelated but important point to make is what we're seeing now is the large cap strategics, more and more of them are doing equity investments. So if you look at Boston Scientific, Medtronic used to do a ton of them. That slowed down. J&J, Abbott, and Boston, and even Intuitive Surgical. So as you consider growing, your businesses and raising capital, I think it's worth thinking about which strategics would be equity investors. And sometimes there's a lot of structure. Sometimes they come with rights. A lot of times they come with no rights. They just come with an observer seat.
It's important just to bring this down to the entrepreneurial level, because I'm sure we'll talk about strategics later. It's the 2 C's. It's strategics will acquire a company on clinical de-risking or commercial de-risking. So just think about that when you're thinking about your life cycle and the cash you need, despite they're talking to you what you think. In the end, if they have established reimbursement and a distribution force, they'll buy you on a positive pivotal. If not, they're going to make you prove the commercial business model prior to acquiring you. 90% of the acquisitions are happening at clinical de-risking and commercial de-risking. Everything else is sort of at the margin.
So for companies in the portfolios of the respective panelists here, so a few years away from an exit, what would you say jumps out as to your best performing portfolio companies? And they can't all be the best performing. So what would you say stands out for your top performers as a consistent theme or a trend across the board that you notice that could be good advice for a new company?
It's hard, as Matt knows, I don't make mistakes, so this is going to be challenging. But if you look at our portfolio, we're kind of fund one. We've made 6 investments. We define success a little differently. I mean, a lot of funds are focused on multiple on money and just maximizing the multiple on your equity investment. We are focused a little differently. We actually are very focused on getting people's money back faster. We're typically looking at investments that return capital in 3 to 5 years. So it's kind of a different thing. So I'll give you 2 case studies quickly that are fundamentally different investments. One is Kestra, a wearable defibrillator vest going after $1 billion market. They went public back in March. That's not a 10x for our fund, but it's a very good return in 8 months. So it's 150% IRR. We get investors back money very quickly. That is kind of a late stage investment and just get capital back quickly and make sure it's funded appropriately to take share. I think that was a good investment because it was ready to be a public company. And we had a good sense of the capital needed to get them to profitability and a good sense of our liquidity and when it would come. Totally other spectrum, because we invest phase 3 pivotal through late commercial, is a company called Alleviant. Alleviant's a direct competitor to a company called V-Wave that J&J bought last year for $1.7 billion. Alleviant's sort of very different. This is, a longer road, right? This is taking new mechanistic risks for structural heart for heart failure. But here, I'd say the value creation event has been clinical de-risking, positive, successful RTTs, and aging of data in our portfolio. So in the last 18 months, we don't have definitive visibility and liquidity, but we've meaningfully taken down the clinical risk. So I said to you at the beginning, we're trying to focus on maximizing optionality and minimizing risk. I'd say Alleviant has been most successful because it has minimized material risk over the last 18 months, and Kestra has been most successful because the path to liquidity was rapid.
So for me, I'm not at JP Morgan anymore, and I'm a partner in a biotech therapeutics venture fund. But my favorite investments in the medtech space, before I left, were actually not core medtech. So I was more focused on areas where I saw huge areas of unmet clinical need, namely in clinical diagnostics, MRD testing, things like that. Things like Natera. I actually really think, companies that are innovating in new areas and adjacencies like Twist are super interesting. But they check the boxes of what I was saying before in terms of high growth, large markets, truly differentiated, excellent management teams, and a clear, defined path to profitability, if not already profitable. And to me, those are when you're in a tough market, and you're managing risk assets and you're literally trying to survive the volatility in the macro, again, which is many times driven by factors and machines that are out of your control. You're really anchoring to names where you truly believe that they will win, in the long run and make it to that horizon. That to me is critical in the public space.
I would also say, because Spine's been beat up a lot on this panel, and it gives this notion of investors are focused on certain thematic areas. And there are many investors, cardiovascular, that are very focused on thematic areas. We're not. We're very sort of bottoms up. Honestly, if you ask me where we focus, it's on these metrics of the business, not the therapeutic vertical of the business. So we look at clinical, commercial, reimbursement. I like to take one of those 3 risks. I don't want to take 2 of those 3 risks. So if I'm taking clinical risk, I have to be darn sure that I've got established reimbursement and an easy commercial path. Or vice versa. But I don't think of things as therapeutic verticals. I think about unmet needs and these very specific metrics we look for in terms of how much risk are we taking.
And then Himani, same question for you on the Symbiotic side. Obviously different profile companies, but some similarities in medtech as well.
No, I mean, for sure. It's a different risk profile. And, just given the nature of the investment that it is, it's debt capital. Don't talk to me unless you have the clinical de-risking. Don't talk to me unless you have the reimbursement all figured out. So the criteria from a debt investment perspective, and for companies to think about, how lenders think about the world is all on the commercial side. And on the commercial side, I mean, unlike what the equity investors underwrite to, which is a fast path to liquidity or a rapid growth in commercial. I mean, from a lender perspective, stability in the business is important. So if you're a commercial company and there is a plan A, which is to grow the business, to grow the top line 40-50%, it's not always an ideal world. It's not always a straight line from A to B. Challenges happen. Things take longer. Markets are not what you expect to be. Tariffs happen and supply chain disruptions happen. So from a lender's perspective, what we look out for in terms of metrics and successful investments across this asset class is having the agility in the business to address your cost structure in response to any strains that you feel on the top line. Having the agility to manage working capital cash flows and other cash streams to kind of adjust to the new reality. If you're not operating on the high growth plan, but a medium growth plan or a low growth plan, having the ability to, figure out how do I get my runway to where it needs to be. Going back to those inflection points that David was talking about, how do I stretch my runway to get to that inflection point where, it may take me 18 months rather than 12 months or 24 months instead of 18 months, but getting to that. So it's a slightly different perspective, but companies that have this kind of thinking, forward thinking of, sure, upside is going to take care of everything, but what am I going to do if, when the rubber meets the road and the reality is not what's on my plan? Like, those companies truly stand out at the very outset when we talk to them. And I can, say with confidence have performed well across our portfolio. And, more generally, the what I've seen across the credit investments through my career.
And the one follow-up question to debt, or not debt specifically, but I think everyone can grasp a seed stage round or a Series A equity round, but what other non-traditional financing pathways are there, whether it's licensing or a small royalty agreement or funding potentially from a university, any other pathways that people should be thinking about early on in their life cycle? So Himani or Milt, to the extent you've seen creative structures, would be great to share.
I tend to see things slightly later, CD, pre-IPO. The one thing I'll say is, look, there are a lot of ways to creatively structure pre-IPO financings, and sometimes companies, needs another $30 million to bridge it to IPO, and that's a little too small for a Series D. So what do? Well, we've had some instances where we've just structured a convertible note priced at a discount to the IPO. And that way everybody's happy and there's a little bit of risk off the table and the company gets funded well through the IPO. So that's one option. And the other one I mentioned was, the strategic investment, right?
I would say do not underestimate, and many of you are no stranger to this, the importance of grant-funded investment. I am always surprised how far some of these businesses get on grant funding, not just the early investment, but having an active grant-funded business through the life cycle of the asset. It can generate $5, $10, $15, $20 million up front, but it can be $3 to $5 million ongoing throughout the life cycle. There are some companies, largely the ones that come out of tech transfer offices, understand this business, that are just masters at this. But I'm amazed the dichotomy between those who get it and those who don't get it as it relates to these grant-funded businesses. I mean, I've seen businesses that have raised $60 million and $35 million of that capital has come from grant-funded enterprises. That's incredible. Now, you not always get full credit for the grant-funded money as capital in, but you have advanced your business because of that grant-funded money. So number one, that would be my focus. The second thing is be wary of creating exotic structures. I had a company that spun out of Mayo Clinic call me 2 months ago, and they said, hey, we know our valuation at $200 million. This is a seed, kind of a seed Series A business. We know that's very high, but we're open to you placing significant amounts of warrant coverage on top of this investment. And my point back to them was, look, there's 1,000 things that are going to go wrong with this investment from seed to exit. Creating exotic structure in the first 6 to 12 months of the life cycle of this asset is not something I or anyone else is going to be interested in. You have to have clean structures early. Structures tend to get complicated late. So be careful about being exotic early, because you can start creating toxic pills for investors that have to get involved and restructure cap tables and recap situations. Everyone says I'm willing to do that. No one wants to do that. So be wary of complicated structures early.
I'll add one more to that list of what not to do. Would be I speak from my vantage point of being on the other side of the ledger here, which is on the debt side. And one of the things I've seen across my career, and we've seen it together, Randy, in terms of things going wrong, is putting too much leverage or not at the right time. Whether it's, pure term loan kind of leverage that we're talking about, or some creative structures around working capital financings or bank lines or credit lines. And I mean, half of what we do, probably more than half of what we do, is having conversations with businesses, telling them, okay, this is not the right time, and this is too much leverage, and this is too much complexity that you're thinking about. And so, doing it at the right time and at the right level is I would put in another category of, you can get creative, but, keep it simple.
I mean, Matt did this for 25 years, and only in his last 2 years at JP Morgan did he know there was something called a balance sheet. It's a true story. Anyway, the balance sheet wags the dog.
His wife is a lot nicer than he is.
I agree with Himani. That can be a fantastic tool. It just has to be used carefully. So that makes sense. One more question on financing rounds coming together and valuations these days. So for any of the companies that have raised maybe too much capital at too high of a valuation in the past, whether that was in 2021 heyday or in recent years, is it ever okay to raise a down round? And when should companies seriously think about resetting their capitalization to start fresh and grow from here and revert to common and start anew? Matt, David, Himani.
I actually just met a diagnostic company that was a sort of a COVID era darling and did a recap from 400 down to 50. So, the times are what they are. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the markets dictate what you're worth. You don't get to decide. So you obviously have to be, I'm always an advocate for keeping your eyes open and looking beyond what's in front of you and really paying attention to what the world is doing. If you can stay ahead of it, when things are ebullient and you have access to capital and you're going to need it, take more. And worry less about the dilution, right? Because you never know when you're going to be on the other side of that, and it's tough.
100%. I would say this is the area, I think, where boards fail their entrepreneurs every single time. They're sitting in the boardroom, they're trying to manage a positive mark in their portfolio, and they're so desperately trying to hold on to that mark, they put the company into a cash crunch that results in a recap of the business that is 2 times as worse as it would have been had they been, opportunistic a year before. And I also will say interest rate environments have changed. I'm not going to bore you about interest rates and what that means for, quote, the cost of capital. That's a tough discussion. But the point is, everyone knows its access to capital is more expensive and harder to get. And that's happened in the last 3 years as we kind of came out of COVID and rates changed. What entrepreneurs haven't figured out and boards haven't figured out is it's the operational focus of cash flow. Because cash was easier to get, they would say things like, well, that is a risky strategy. It's going to cost us $10 million. If we're wrong, no problem. I'll get another $10 million. Cash flow has not fully permeated entrepreneurs as it relates to how they're thinking strategically and operationally about their businesses. And that's pretty scary. And I see it all the time, right? You got to fund your business when you can, and you got to live to fight another day.
Yeah, I would add and say you got to be realistic about where the market is. I can't tell you how many times where we've run a private placement process to raise $100 million, and we get the $100 million. It's just $50 million, lower than the last round, and the VCs won't go for it. And we spend another 4 months going through it, and we end up in the same spot, which is okay. We'll take it. Right. And the second thing is, I think Matt made it. I've been doing this 25 years. I've never had a CFO or board come back and say, you know what? You told us to raise too much money. Okay. Take it when you can get it, because you never know what's going to happen. And that bit of dilution, it's as an advisor, it's not my dilution, and I understand the sensitivity to it. But if the company is something that everyone believes in, that dilution, that additional dilution, and you raise that money, nobody's going to care about that.
Yeah, and as someone who's been fortunate to have been one of the ultimate consumers of IPO products coming out of the venture community for a very long time, if your product is good and the team is good and you're on the right growth path, the multiple expansion will take care of itself. People used to pay 5 times sales for something, then they'll pay 10, then they'll pay 15 times. It's all about the timing of the market. But if you're not there and you're not ready and you're not well capitalized and you haven't done the right things to build the business to take advantage when the opportunity presents itself, you're nowhere.
Almost out of time here, but one more question I had on the strategics that we were speaking about before. So taking investment from strategic can be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be a great thing because it gets you access to a larger medtech company. They're on your cap table. You can have a commercial arrangement with them or a collaboration arrangement with them, or if any large medtechs are in the room, you can shut your ears for this part. It can also be tough on the flip side if you align yourself to just one group, and it may actually be a negative when speaking with other groups. So I guess Milt or others, any advice for companies when they're thinking about selecting a strategic, how they should go about that process, and when is the right time to approach?
Well, you point out the consideration, which is if you're in cardiology and your investor is Medtronic, does that scare off Boston and J&J and Abbott from doing something? But the upshot is there's validation that a large cap strategic has invested in your company, right? I think the upside outweighs the downside. And sometimes we see 2, sometimes 3 strategics invested in a company. The key here is not giving away too many rights. And you see rights of first negotiation, but never some other rights. So it comes in different flavors. It depends on how your financing round is coming together. But I would say in general, I wouldn't shy away from considering a strategic. The second thing is a little less about quantitative and more about qualitative. You got to trust the individual on the other side of the venture arm of the strategic, right? They are collaborative and, their money is as good as anybody else's money, but the advice they give you and the insights they give you, that part is an intangible, and you should take that into consideration.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One, there's some people in my business who think you do not take money from strategics early, or you do take money from strategics. I think it is very situational to the business, and I'll sort of explain why. So one, I'm totally fine taking money from strategics, number one. Number two, if you're going to take one, I would take two, right? Create a competitive dynamic from go. I generally lean that way more than I lean the other way, but I'm totally okay with strategics. Number three, do not take debt from strategic. It's perfume coming in, it's sewage coming out. If you're going to take debt, call Himani. Do not take debt from a strategic. You're giving them a shocking amount of control at the top of the cap table to someone who is not your friend. I've seen so many companies take debt from strategics, thought it was the awesome, most non-dilutive capital around, and it is sinking the businesses. Number four, ask yourself a very hard question about whether you want to share the sausage making this early with the company that may or may not buy you. You're going to have a lot of sausage making these businesses, and you're giving all that information to the strategic. And the fifth thing I would tell you is take a very hard look at your barriers to entry. I'll give you a great example. Saluda, company raised $600 million for a closed loop neuromodulation system to treat pain. Okay. They took a bunch of strategics. They stumbled along the way. The strategics took a look at the business and say, you know what? I make the IPGs, the implantable batteries. I make the leads. You just have software. I'm going to do it myself. And they did. And that was a problem. So be very, very honest with yourself about how good you think you are and how defensible your barriers to entry are, because they're either going to buy you or they're going to copy you.
They made more than one mistake on that list that you just laid out, right? So I think that was a great lineup.
Okay, I think we have a couple minutes left for questions at this point. I don't know if there's a mic going around, but if you have a question, just put your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. Okay, all right.
You were talking about the era of centralization and now the era of decentralization. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. So again, this is a topic we were talking about prior to coming up here. The period in the early 2000s, probably till 2017, maybe 2000 and right before the Great Recession, 2007 to 2017, that decade, hospitals were consolidating. There was a perception that the shift of pricing power was going toward the hospitals and away from the physicians. And so most of the medtech industry responded by saying, hey, we need scale. Right? We need scale to preserve our pricing power. And that didn't turn out to be true. At the end of the day, physicians, they, for the most part, dictate what devices to use. Now, there is truth to more and more physician practices are being owned by hospitals or joining hospital systems. But at the end of the day, they're making the decisions. And that drove a wave of consolidation. And when you look at some of these big deals that happened, you buy a big asset, it comes with some stuff you don't want. And all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you got a garage full of, med tech businesses that you're like, oh, how did I get all of this? And you got a clean house. So we're in that phase right now. I think a lot of these non-core businesses probably are good businesses, but didn't get the investment that they needed to grow, only because they weren't the reason that the buyer acquired these, 10 years ago. So we're seeing an unwind of that. And you look at Baxter. Baxter's, sold off their biopharma solutions business, sold off Vantive, Invista came out. So I think we're going to see more and more of that going forward. And it should free up, as it relates to, I think, this topic, it should free up some margin and some capital to go out and do some growth enhancing acquisitions.
Okay. Any other questions? There's one on the right.
I have your email addresses, so this is just me being selfish. But within our portfolio, I advise our startups to pursue strategics that either have manufacturing capabilities similar to developing their projects, or have sales reps who are calling on the same sales point. Is that inadequate of a framework, or accurate of a framework, or just completely irrational?
Just want to clarify, are you talking about synergies, how strategic buyers look at targets?
Precisely.
Yeah. So there's two flavors of that. One is a new leg of growth, where you see a company get into a new market because that core market's growing a lot faster than their core market, and there's little in the way of synergies. In that case, that company, and I'm talking about in terms of publicly traded companies, those shareholders may not be happy, but strategically it may be the right move. But most companies will look at a smaller target and build in cost synergies, right? The other way to look at it is from the buyer's standpoint. What synergies can come out from that infrastructure? So a lot of times you see, J&J buying Shockwave. Sometimes they pick the best athletes among that commercial organization. Or J&J acquiring Abiomed. That's a sales force they did not have, right? But almost always you have the G&A, just the back office expenses, accounting, finance, the board expenses come out. You do have marketing, not the sales organization, but the marketing expenses. And then you'd be surprised how much headcount is in R&D. So we look at R&D synergies in two ways. We look at the dollars spent toward clinical trials, and that's good dollars spent, and then the R&D staff, the QA and RA. I mean, there's a lot of money spent for small cap companies. So that's how large cap acquirers look at their synergies.
But I would add, as someone who's been involved in many of these things, that oftentimes the large cap companies acquire growth and ruin it. Or impair it, right? A, because the growth is already starting to slow and they're sort of buying it at the top, but B, because the amount of disruption that happens within the organization, the sales force, that entrepreneurial spirit dissipates, and then it's actually you need boots on the ground to grow the company. But
I just make 2 points on that. One is to Milt's point, every transformative large mega med tech deal, Zimmer Biomet, classic example. Zimmer Biomet promised $8. This is 8 years ago. They promised $8 in earnings in the forward year. They're still not there, right? What's the problem? MedTech widgets. What's the great thing about MedTech? When you get it right, you almost have pharmaceutical-like gross margin. So if you can grow your business, cost will take care of itself. By cost cutting and hitting growth, once you're growing 0 or 1, 2, 3 below the inflation rate, you can't get ahead of yourself from a margin perspective. So all those mega deals that were based on getting to earnings and profitability, every one of those companies missed because they missed on growth. Number 2, I don't think strategics care about manufacturing synergies because they're going to keep the assets separate for 3 to 5 years. But what they've increasingly figured out is they've got to feel confident they can make the asset. Medtronic bought Affera, totally missed the boat on what it was going to take to manufacture that product. Boston Scientific had to shut down the Lotus acquisition because they could not make it profitably. 10 years ago, no medtech did that diligence. Now they are much more sophisticated about making sure the widget can be made at scale.
Okay, with that, I think we are over. So thank you guys so much, and thank you to the panel. Appreciate it.